Good afternoon. My name's Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange. Welcome to this very important book launch of this sovereign isle, Britain in and out of Europe, by Robert Toombs, one of the leading historians and protagonists in the Brexit debate. Delighted also to have outstanding panel here today to reflect on all aspects of the current debate. For those of you who've read Professor Toombs's remarkable and most well-received history of England, this is, as he said in this work, a kind of postscript to that to accommodate events of recent years. He's going to speak first, and then we're going to have our other panelists, and then we're opening the floor to questions. So, Professor Toombs, thank you for coming here today. As I say, we're delighted to be able to launch this and look forward to having to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks to you, Dean, and to Policy Exchange for having organised this. And remarkable testimony to your influence. Thank you to the extremely prestigious and distinguished panel who far beyond my deserts, or expectations, I might say, but I'm very grateful to them for being willing to take part in this. It's an honour, great honour, but it's also slightly unnerving because I'm a historian and I'm used to writing about people who are safely dead. And they're not only alive, but they're also here and able to answer back. So that's a new experience for me. I'd like to make three fairly short points to start off the discussion. On the cause of Brexit, the others are much better qualified than I am to talk about the present and the future. So I'll talk a little about the past. It's common to ascribe Brexit to exceptionalism, to British exceptionalism, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether it's down to our attachment to parliamentary sovereignty or to the common law, or our strong attachment to independence, if you're on one side of the argument, or it's down to our nostalgia, bigotry, racism, etc., if you're on the other side. And there are clearly differences between our experience of the last, especially the last century, and that of almost the whole of the continent. Particularly our experience of it was much less traumatic. And also we owed our survival to a considerable extent to overseas allies. So I think our view of the past, of the recent past, is somewhat different. What precise difference does this make? Well, I think it means that fewer of the middle class in Britain were firmly committed to the vision of an integrated Europe in the way that is much more common on the continent as a sort of bulwark against war, nationalism, a descent or a revival of old demons and so on. And it also means that Euroscepticism in Britain was a more mainstream phenomenon than in most continental countries where it's confined to the political margins of extreme left or extreme right. And those differences are obviously quite important. But otherwise, there was very little difference in 2016 between the views of Europe held by most people in the UK and those held in most of the continent. Indeed, in a number of countries, such as France, Italy, and Greece, most obviously, the EU was much more unpopular than it was in Britain. In Germany and the Netherlands, it was about the same. So little difference between our views of Europe and those of our neighbours, although our views of the EU, I should say, and those of our neighbours. Certainly not enough difference to explain why we voted to leave. As President Macron told Andrew Marr in January 2018, the French in majority would have liked to have a vote too, and he said they would probably have voted to leave. I think that's worth bearing in mind. And yet, of course, it was only the UK that did or is likely in the foreseeable future to want to leave the EU. And that's my second point. What are the reasons for that? Pretty obviously, the reasons why we originally joined have become much weaker, and the disadvantages of membership have become more visible. One of Edward Heath's advisors talked about Britain being the Titanic and Europe being the lifeboat. That is no longer how most people feel, and therefore the reasons for being members were weaker. But above all, the reason we left is blindingly obvious and simple. First of all, we had a vote, which most European governments would certainly not allow, and of course which they regarded as completely irresponsible and crazy on the part of David Cameron. And the second reason is that we were not members of the euro. And this seems to me the decisive difference. Indeed, if there is a reason that explains Brexit, it is surely that. Every other issue is secondary, simply because once one is in the euro, leaving it becomes extremely risky, not only to national finances and to a national economy, but to everyone's savings in the bank. And for that reason, I think one can regard Gordon Brown as the father of Brexit. My final point would be whether or not we should think of Brexit as inevitable. My answer to that would be not inevitable, but certainly likely. And here I very much take the view of my colleague in Cambridge, Professor Helen Thompson, who's written that after 2005, a no vote would have been likely whatever the question on the ballot paper. And therefore, the sustainability of British membership of the EU really depended on there not being a vote. Well, Brexit happened. For a time, it clearly consolidated the EU, which it seems to me to be a resignation to what is seen as the inevitability of membership. What happens in the future is certainly not for me to predict, because, as I said, other members of the panel are far more qualified to talk about what is happening now and what they think will happen in the future to the Union, to our relationship with the EU, and longer term to the EU itself. So thank you very much, Dean, for asking me, and I look forward to hearing what the others have to say.
For the past quarter century, and of course also an outstanding former Northern Ireland Secretary when I first had the pleasure to interlocute with him, Lord Mandelson.
Thank you very much, Dean, and it's a delight for me to be here with you. I think that Robert's book contains his usual vim and lightness of style. I very much enjoyed his previous excellent book about Anglo-French relations, but having enjoyed that, I must say I regard Robert as a good man, fallen amongst conservative Brexiters. Perhaps I can also congratulate David Frost on his new role. I mean, he is a distinguished former civil servant and, of course, my new colleague in the House of Lords, and no doubt he's here to tell us how our relations with Europe will no longer be run by unelected bureaucrats. Two things have struck me most reading the book. First, I'm afraid I do have to point out, as a former Northern Ireland Secretary, its title, this sovereign isle, rather than these sovereign isles. I think the distinction is important for those of us who are not closet Republicans. Second, this book is a clear exposition of the Leavers' view of the story of Brexit. It doesn't purport to be comprehensive or balanced. And I think it shows importantly how far apart Remainers and Remainers and Leavers still are, from a common understanding of the meaning and the consequences of Brexit. Perhaps this doesn't matter, but if we are to succeed as a country, a shared understanding might help going forwards. I mean, post-Brexit, the question for us is no longer remain or leave, but whether we are going to succeed or fail in making the most of the opportunities that we now have and overcome, or at least manage, the downsides of leaving. Now, one day we might re-enter the European Union in some form, and I think that probably depends on how the EU itself evolves. But I think the important point is this: if we go back, we should not and cannot go back as a weakened supplicant, but only as a successful country. And this means we should recognize that Britain economically really is at a crossroads now, as I wrote in the Sunday Times the other month. In a real sense, post-Brexit, we have to reinvent ourselves for the new era or face, frankly, national decline. And obviously, I will opt every day for reinvention. Now, Brexit, in other words, in my view, has to be viewed as a catalyst, as a sort of severe jolt to the system. And we either fall apart, you know, or we get our act together. And in a real sense, we actually have to be more energetic than before just to stand still. Now, my key insight is this, and I'll sort of leave you with it. Having left the European Union, what we're doing as a country is replacing weight with nimbleness. We had the weight and the size of the European Union and all its advantages, and now we have the opportunity instead to design our own moves and to use speed and nimbleness of decision-making in order to do so. And this applies particularly, but not only to regulatory matters. And we have to work out how to make the most of this opportunity without further jeopardizing our trade position in Europe. As far as global Britain is concerned, I think there's also opportunity for nimbleness, but there are two outstanding facts of life. First, we will only be influential externally if we are successful internally, returning to my original point about success. We must become, in other words, a nation that others want to emulate, and that is going to require, in my view, some major, bold strategic moves on our part, which I think have yet to take shape, but we saw the beginning of those with the integrated review yesterday. Secondly, and this is my final point, you know, we are going to find the world a much rougher place to be in if our relations with the European Union are broken as they are now. We cannot mend them while disagreements on that other isle I mentioned, on Northern Ireland, create ever more dysfunction. And Northern Ireland can never work while we have a broken relationship with the European Union, as I argued in my FT letter this morning. So I hope that both we and the EU step back to think how we get out of this sort of vicious circle, because we're presently, in my view, on a dangerous downward path. And in this, amongst us, David Frost has the greatest responsibility now to put things right. I mean, I do think it would be helpful if ardent Brexiters could recognize the tension that is being created between their belief in a pure Brexit, which minimizes our ties to our European neighbors on the one hand, and the preservation of the Union of the United Kingdom on the other. Because I say this in view of how this hard Brexit is impacting both Scotland and Northern Ireland and weakening our country's union. And I just think it's time for us to give that some rather more sophisticated and balanced thought than the government seems to be doing at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Mandelson. And if I'd ask people to put their virtual hands up for questions, red hands of Ulster or other, all welcome. I think actually the emoji is a red hand, but not quite like the province, the symbol of the province of Ulster. So if you could put up your questions and state your name and organisation, please, when coming to ask the questions, that would be very much appreciated. I'd now call upon Lord Frost. Congratulations on your new appointment. Lord Frost, as I say, always welcome here. And I know you've got to leave early today, so I think if others could also give a chance perhaps for any questions to you, that would be much appreciated by confining their remarks. Lord Frost, welcome.
Thank you, Dean. I hope everyone can hear me okay. We had a government IT fail at the critical moment, but I'm back on my phone now, so if I sound a bit tinny, that is why. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Robert, for giving us such a fascinating read with this book. I enjoyed it, and although it is short, commendably so, when so many new publications could do with a bit of editing down, in my view. There's a lot of food for thought in it. And thank you too to Lord Mandelson for his kind words, and I look forward to debating him across the floor of the House in due course. I just want to say three things, perhaps, without responding to everything that's been said so far. I think first point I want to make really is that is one you make, Robert, in the book, which is that the Magna Carta tradition in the UK, and you quote, I quote, the idea that when fundamental choices have to be made, the people decide and the rulers obey. Now, obviously, not everybody in Britain sort of subscribes to the Magna Carta tradition as a meaningful part of their sort of daily life, but I think it is a meaningful something in our political tradition. And it comes to the point that I made in my Telegraph article the other week, which is that Brexit is about democracy. It's sometimes forgotten in the debate about technicalities of the terms of trade and so on, but that it is about democracy, it's about control, it's about meaning that we have a meaningful say in this country about the laws that are made on our behalf. And I think, although I actually agreed with what a lot of Lord Mandelson said, which I hope finds a bit reassuring, I still think the sort of slightly dismissive caricature of a hard Brexit misses the fact that soft Brexit means other people set laws that we have to live by. And I still don't find a satisfactory answer to the proposition that for part of our national life we should abide by laws that are set by others over which we have no control. And I think that's the logic that takes us to hard Brexit, if that's what you want to call it. It's the logic of democracy. Second point, Robert, you raised in your book the question of, was Brexit inevitable? And you say in the introduction it wasn't, but on the other, you go on to suggest that it was putting Britain at the start of Europe as a sort of geopolitical fantasy, like Plantagenet ambitions to be kings of France. It does leave me wondering about whether unreconciled Remainers are like the Jacobites with Guy Verhofstadt as the king over the water. But historical analogies only take you so far. And I do think that I do actually share your conclusion that it wasn't inevitable, but there were quite strong forces that took us there. It's obvious, I think, every society, every modern society has its own preferences about collective action, levels of taxation, trade, schools, health, universities, etc. They're all very different across Europe. And I think the UK does have, arguably has economic preferences that are a bit more, quote, sort of global, if you like, or more American, but social preferences that are maybe more European. And it's the kind of balance between those two things that has explained why our debate has been so sort of fraught and problematic. It's been reconciling those two views. So although it's never inevitable, I think Brexit was always a realistic possibility when the conditions were right. And you say, Robert, you quote, the simplest explanation for Brexit was this: the British have been given a vote. And maybe that's sort of what it comes down to. Third point, and final point from me, looking forward, what happens now? And again, I very much agree actually with Lord Mandelson about the need for renewal and moving forward. What struck me when I was in government as a civil servant is that I felt EU membership had produced a kind of sort of institutional paralysis and kind of learned failure in many areas that went well beyond the areas that were within EU competence. Where the first instinct on areas where there were EU competence was sort of to wait for EU ideas, to consult, then to resist, to take second best, to discuss, and so on. And I think that instinct spread elsewhere. it gradually seemed to become harder and harder for us to solve problems, even when it was in our power, and we got better at managing process, not outcomes. And if I look at the effort Michael Gove had to put in to make education reform work in the early years of the last decade, that's just one problem. But as a country, we have a huge list of unresolved problems, theoretically in our power, but which we seem to find very difficult to summon up the will to resolve. And I do think that EU membership had a kind of sapping quality to our ability to take decisions. So to finish, Brexit doesn't solve those problems, but it does give us the means to solve it, to move on, to get a grip, to reform the state, but also sort of to reform our own attitudes and become a country that can deal with problems again. And Robert, you say it's the beginning of an effort to improve social cohesion, shake up a tired system of government, reset an exhausted national strategy. I think it is all those things. I think we've begun that work in the last year, and I look forward to doing a bit more in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Frost. Much appreciated. Thank you for that presentation. Amber Rudd, been a great friend to Policy Exchange through the years and a number of ministerial posts. Always welcome here. Please look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Dean. And Robert, you're absolutely right. It's Dean's pulling power that made us all come here, I'm sure. One of the joys of leaving politics is that I was able to leave Brexit behind. So it was with some trepidation that I agreed with Dean to read your book and attend this. And actually, since I left politics, I've had the joy of generally only reading things I agree with. Which is one of the blessings of being able to choose your own literature, being on Twitter, only following the people who actually have the same views of you. So I slightly got alarmed when I read your book, and I found that, as Peter pointed out, it's very much a Leavers book. And there is a lot there for Leavers to nod vigorously with, and for those of us who took a different view to shake our heads at. I mean, I particularly found some of the examples of why you thought that some people voted for Remain and other voters to leave just so tribal. I was slightly laughing out loud. I don't want to be rude, but I brought your attention to your very brief look at why women voted for Remain in a much greater proportion than was expected and than men. And your only point is that women don't like risk. So I took the time to look that up and look at the reference that you had made to that. And that was based on the fact there were studies about how men and women cross roads. So I didn't find it very convincing. I think that if I was to look at why the majority of women voted for Remain, it's not so much about risk, but it does merit some examining. But I can tell you, as somebody who attended some of the final polling, which of course, as we know, turned out to be very wrong, one of the phrases that rung most truly with Leavers and didn't work for Remainers was, women's liberation has gone too far. There was a slight feeling that this was a man's project. And a lot of the people to do with the original UKIP, the Leave campaign, Brexit, did look to a lot of women as a group of men having a man's comradely endeavor, as it were, and that women didn't really have a place there. And as we know, women do get a little alarmed when they see women being excluded. And I think that one of the things that has carried on here, and I tread into slightly dangerous ground here, away from your book perhaps, is that Boris Johnson's government has continued with that. And I lament the fact that we are now only at 20% women in his cabinet. And there are very few women who are put up on the front line. There's been lots of reviewing on that. But I find that is a continuation of the Brexit campaign. I'm conscious that I'm doing exactly what I pointed out you did in your book, using perhaps my own facts to evidence what I already feel. So forgive me for doing that. The issue that I wanted to pick up as well was one that Peter made to David, which is concerns, and I read your letter, very much agreed with you this morning in the FT, Peter, was the issue of what is our relationship with Europe going to continue to be now? And when I last saw Boris Johnson one-to-one, one of the conversations we had is, what now for the UK government's relationship with the EU? And his position at that point was very much that he wanted to put it aside. We've done Brexit, and then we can move on. And I had hoped that is what we were going to get. And I'm concerned that the government is going to continue to use Brexit as a useful stick politically in any engagement with the EU in order to show that this still isn't done. And it's a useful thing to continue to revive, when I long for the day that we can talk about Britain's success or failure in the new regime without having to continually label Remainers or Leavers as though it was a sin to be on one side and not the other. I hope that the government will help us do that. The final point is that I must say I really enjoyed the historical narrative, particularly at the start of your book leading up to it. So thank you for that. But when your description of what you felt was those of us who were in cabinet at the time trying to stop Brexit, I think you missed a really soul-searching, agonizing time. I hope that Michael will endorse this. He and I were there at the time when we were desperate to find a compromise. People would accuse us of trying to stop Brexit, not real Brexit. The party was divided, the country was divided. We longed. It was honest, earnest, and desperate, and eventually failed. But I think you don't give us credit for the true effort we made to try to find a peaceful resolution as the crowds outside Parliament stoked up further and further. It was interesting hearing from in your introduction that you originally had been pro the common market. I felt that perhaps if you'd been asked to, you could have written an equally interesting book putting the case for Remain. But then what a ridiculous idea, 2 articles or 2 books arguing for different points of view. Thank you.
Very much appreciate it. Over now to final panelist, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, always welcome here again, of course, as our founding chair of trustees back when you were a mere jobbing journalist. Over to you, Michael.
Dean, thank you for the invitation. As everyone attests, you are the modern-day Marchioness of Londonderry, the political and literary Circe of our times. You draw people together in your salon, and everyone wants to be part of it. And of course, you choose the most interesting issues for us to discuss and the most interesting people to discuss them with. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for bringing David, Robert, Amber, Peter, and I together. I just wanted to make 3 sort of general points, and then obviously look forward to questions. The first thing is that I think that the choice leave or remain, but both options, of course, have equal validity and equal nobility, in my view. And they go back through different historic choices and paradigms. Essentially, are you in favor of a nation state, or are you in favor of an empire, essentially? And I'm saying that not trying to freight either choice with particular pejorative terms. There have been, as Boris wrote in his brilliant book, The Dream of Rome, throughout time, people who've seen in empires the promise of freer commerce, freer movement, of a greater degree of efficiency, and in some respects, liberty. Through the existence of empires. But there have always been those who've argued that actually the nation state provides a greater degree of responsiveness on the part of rulers, a greater degree of solidarity amongst its members, a greater degree of resilience faced with the difficult political choices that have to be made. And again, throughout history, the choice of the Dutch Republic to become a nation and to free itself from the Habsburgs, the choice of the American colonists to free themselves from Britain, and indeed the choice of countries to leave the what was then the Soviet Union. All of these were choices in favor of nation states and against empires. And again, I want to stress that in all of those choices there was an equal legitimacy, because there is a nobility in the European ideal, particularly given the way in which nationalism became a vessel in the 20s and 30s in Europe for the worst sorts of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And for people who had suffered from that, it is entirely understandable that they would wish to have a political construct that would deal with what they saw as that virus, that bacillus, And from that, the European Union was born. And it's entirely understandable that countries like the Spain and Portugal, which had suffered under authoritarian dictatorships for longer, and countries in Eastern Europe should want to be part of something which was a means, essentially, of providing them with an exorcism of the past. Now, I believe, as David does, that nation states have virtues which are worth preserving, worth prizing, and which will indeed be increasingly important in the future. But the first thing to stress, and indeed Robert does this, is that there is an idealism behind the European Union, and we should, whatever criticisms we may make of the way in which the project has worked out, we should always acknowledge that, and always acknowledge that those who saw Britain's destiny within the European Union were governed by just as much a level of idealism and generosity of spirit as anyone. The second thing, though, is in judging between empires and nation states, between confederations and nations, one of the questions that we have to ask is, what benefits does it bring to our citizens? And here I think Peter made a very, very good point. Indeed, he echoed Ursula von der Leyen when she was talking about some of the vaccine choices that have been made. The UK was a speedboat rather than the cruiser that the European Union was. And this is very much Peter's point about weight versus nimbleness. And one of the things that Robert's book brings out brilliantly is that on a number of occasions when crises have occurred recently in Europe, the cruiser has been incapable of making the decisions necessary in order to safeguard its people. So the Euro crisis, the migration crisis, and indeed, there are current travails, which do mean that the European Union, whatever its claims and pretensions to efficiency overall, has been found wanting. And I think one of the reasons that it has been found wanting is that nation states can be more nimble because of the feedback loop between those exercising power and the electors is faster. And that greater degree of responsiveness is both a good in itself, I believe, but also a spur to greater efficiency, particularly given the world in which we live. And that takes me to my final point, which goes to the point that Amber made and others made about tribes. Again, I deprecate the way, and Robert is very good about this, in which people are badged as Remainers or Leavers, and that is supposed to capture all of their identity. As Robert points out, it's a bit like the Blues and the Greens in Byzantium, or the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and so on. And that's not helpful, but it does speak to something true, which is that even though there are caricatures that populate our debate, those caricatures do speak to something important. And that important thing is this: globalization across the Western world has tended to mean that those with credentials and connections find the world and its institutions an easier and more comfortable route to success and fulfillment. And whether one talks about people who have been left behind, not a phrase I like, but a phrase that has currency, it was undoubtedly the case that for many people, the vote to leave the European Union was a yank on the chain. It was saying to those with those credentials and the connections, listen to us. Life may work for you. The institutions that you steward may bring you all sorts of benefits, but the benefits for us are nowhere near as clear. The story is told, I'm sure it's apocryphal, that during the Brexit campaign, one Remainer was talking about the importance of GDP and the potential loss of GDP that would flow from leaving the European Union. And a voice in the crowd said, that's all very well, that's your GDP, not mine. Now, I know that story may mean many things to many people, but the point overall is that for some who were making the Remain case, the case was couched in abstract economic terms, which reflected some unexamined self-interest. Whereas for many of those who voted to leave, what they wanted to do was to exert what Tony Benn or Michael Foot would have called democratic control over capital. And that's my final point. It is sometimes the case that Brexiteers are caricatured as figures from the right or the hard right. I think it's really important, and Robert's book brings this out, to remember that there is a dissenting tradition in British politics. I mentioned Michael Foot, but it's also the case that remains the case with people like Maurice Glassman or Professor Richard Tuck or Chris Bickerton or indeed Helen Thompson, whom he mentions. There are people on the left, most powerfully and most recently Perry Anderson in the London Review of Books, who reached the same conclusion as Robert. I've no idea how Robert voted before Brexit. I've no idea whether he's a Tory, a Whig, a Blue Labour, Red, whatever. But one thing I do know is that if we are to, as Peter, Amber, Robert and David all want us to, make the most of the future, then I think that we need to recognise that the reasons why people voted to leave are multiplicitous, and that it's important that we treat those reasons, much as I hope we can also treat the sense of loss that many Remainers feel, with mutual respect.
Thank you, and Michael, thank you for that outstanding contribution. Robert Toombs, since much has been said about your book, I just wonder if you would come back for a few moments to give you right of reply and then open to the floor and the questions.
Well, can I just make 2 points? First of all, this book was written in the heat of combat, as it were, and perhaps if I were writing it in 2 years' time, it would be rather less a work of a party, which it certainly is. I mean, it's meant to be making a particular argument. One thing I thought, I was very pleased to know to see that I agreed with much of what Lord Mandelson and Amber Rudd said. And one of the things is that we all agree that this, if it's to be worth having gone through this extremely unpleasant experience, it has to be a new beginning in some way, a catalyst for change. And I think that's something that could bring us back together. I'd sooner not go on any longer than that, Dean, unless you want me to, because I'm maybe people want to ask questions.
Well, there may be more coming up. Always, as I say, welcome to come back in, because this is your work and it stimulates this remarkable debate. I see a number of people's hands have been put up. Minna Bowater, if you just care to say where your name, or well, I've said your name, your organisation as well. That's the house rule.
Am I unmuted now?
Can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
We hear you loud and clear.
Oh, brilliant. Well, it's Robert. I mean, make no bones about it. I am obviously such a supporter of Brexit, but actually, funny enough, your book, The English and Their History, push forward together and make a success of it. Whichever side we were on, it's so important. And one of my fears is that we load ourselves with sacred ideological cows. And my question is this: have we in the West made our system of democracy such a sacred cow that any other system differing from our brand of parliamentary democracy has nothing to teach us? And I'm saying that in relation of threats that we, put sanctions on so-and-so, and we don't do this with so-and-so, and here we are going out into the big wide world. And if we're not nimble, I love that word nimble, Peter used it, over idealistic about things and be so judgmental of others who are different from ourselves.
Robert.
Well, I think that was more a counsel than a question, was it not? But yes, I think as far as democracy is concerned, I think we are probably all deeply attached to the idea that democracy is the system that can adapt, and also that it is the one that best serves most of its people. It's not necessarily in the short term the most efficient, but in the long term, it's always proved to be far more effective than any other system. And I can't see any reason why that will change. The only I forget who, I think, it was Michael Gove who mentioned that this was in some ways a debate between a nation state and an empire. And I think the problem with empires, which may do good in some ways, is that they're always either pre-democratic or post-democratic. It may be that the EU sees itself as a kind of post-democratic empire in which people are no longer capable of making major decisions about things that are far too technical for them to understand. And if that's the case, it seems to me that the EU is storing up huge trouble for itself, and that we have taken a sort of gamble on democracy and national democracy. And it seems to me the safest gamble.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that? Michael.
Just very briefly, the two things at the risk of repeating the wise points that Robert made. I'd just say the first thing is that There is at the moment, there are some thinkers who argue that, in particular, the response to COVID suggests that authoritarian states have an advantage, and that they will, you know, in the ideological competition that exists globally, that authoritarian states are making the running at the moment. I don't believe that. I think that, exactly as Robert says, it can sometimes be the case that authoritarian states can mobilize the resources of their people very quickly in order to achieve particular goals, but in the long term, they will be outcompeted by democracies because of the more responsive system, the greater degree of freedom of inquiry and speech and so on. And, you know, if we look back at historical research on everything from the response to famines to the effectiveness of the Allied response to the Axis in the Second World War, democracies have the resources to be able to learn from mistakes more quickly and to adapt and to be, you know, as Pericles pointed out about Athens, you know, the school of innovation. The second point is the real test for me, and there are many, many tests, is do people want to leave a polity or do people want to join a polity? And if one looks, for example, at the population flows and the number of people who want to come to democracies, that seems to me to be the most powerful vote of confidence. And it is the case that, as has been pointed out, people don't get into life rafts in order to get into China or to Cuba, but the people do want to seek quite rightly a better life for themselves in countries like Britain, America, the Netherlands, and so on. So, at the risk of being, unfair to other political systems, I'm a convinced believer that liberal democracy is not just morally right, but also efficient as well.
Thank you. Lisa Carroll from The Guardian. Are you there? We can't hear you. Okay, I'll come back to you if you would just indicate you want to come back in by raising your electronic hand. Viscount Ridley.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you for this fascinating event. I'd be keen to hear Robert Tombs's response to the implied point that both Amber Rudd and Peter Mandelson made, which is that the reason we're not best friends with Europe in the wake of Brexit is because we have made a choice in that direction. Certainly seen from Northumberland, it doesn't feel that way. It feels as if the triggering of Article 16 and the slide towards what might be called the war of Jenkins vaccine has largely been driven by hostility from the other side of the channel. But I'd be interested to know whether Robert Tombs agrees with that.
Well, that's certainly how it looks. I mean, it's never been a surprise that most European politicians regarded Brexit as a disaster for us and also a disaster for themselves, and that it was something that could not be shown to be either easy or beneficial. It was said over and over again. I always hope there would be a point, and no doubt there will be a point, at which the EU decides that Brexit is now irreversible and that it's in its interest to have the best relationship with us that it can. But at the moment, a lot of things that are said and done seem to be deliberately aimed at making us remember that we have done something that they disapprove of.
Amber.
And I would say, Matt, that it's my hope that both sides will try to make this work, not one side or the other. But both sides, rather like us all here, have our own partisan positions, which they're going to continue to reinforce unless we make a conscious effort not to. Let us see how the government handles the upcoming by-election. If it turns into another Brexit war, I think that would be a great shame.
Peter, did you want to come in at all?
Yeah, I would. I mean, look, there are obviously fearful teething troubles, but let's be honest too. I mean, trust between the two sides has basically cratered. I mean, the most immediate problem is Northern Ireland. And frankly, until we can get to a place where the European Union has faith that the UK is meeting the legal commitments that it sort of chose to sign up to undertake, we are not going to get out of this situation. That's why I have argued this morning that the UK must make clear privately and publicly that it is going to fulfill the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the provisions which it felt it wanted to adopt. It voluntarily embraced them. It looked at the alternative, didn't like it, so it opted for what the UK government finally agreed to. But I would say too, that at that point, the European Union has got to show flexibility to permit an Irish Sea border that is tolerable for unionists in Northern Ireland. I mean, if both sides don't do this, I mean, the UK government making clear its commitment to what it signed, and then the European Union adopting a bit more flexibility and a bit of a light touch, then things will only get worse. And I'm very worried by that because, you know, it's been a pretty brutal divorce in any case. Living next door to a big regulatory power like the European Union is never going to be comfortable for Britain. And quite honestly, we are a long way off working out, you know, how we and our European neighbours are going to live and work together. And given that we do share a neighbourhood, given that we do share interests, given that we do have common interests, common values, given that so much of what confronts us, the challenges we need to take on, you know, we share, and in a sense, we'll address those challenges better in some respects if we're doing so in cooperation rather than separately and apart. I really do think this is a priority for both sides, starting, as I say, with the UK government that's got to make clear it's going to stand by what it's signed up to.
Thank you. Liz O'Carroll, another shot. Are you there? Are you there? Don't hear you. I'm sorry, we'll move on. John Holbrook, barrister. Can you hear me? Can you come in?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Dean, and thank you, panelists. I found that discussion very interesting and reassuring, actually, just to be reminded that, of course, Brexit was really all about democracy and ensuring that we as a nation are able to make our own laws. And if that process is to be taken for a challenge to our ability to make our own laws than the EU does, that, of course, was the point Theresa May made when she was supposedly campaigning to stay in the EU. So what does Robert and what do the panelists think about that issue?
Robert.
Oh gosh. Well, at the moment, I think the time is not yet ripe, I would say. I mean, I think we've had enough political conflict to last us for a few years, and I think this is something that would cause more dissension. I can see the theoretical advantages of repatriating the European Convention of Human Rights and making it a Bill of Rights in English law, and that might be in all sorts of ways better. But I wouldn't look forward to what we would go through in bringing that about. But that shows that I'm perhaps not quite as combative as some suggested earlier in my book.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that?
I think it would just offer another gift to the SNP. And my word, they've already had enough gifts presented to them on a plate. I don't think we need any more. I mean, the sense of cutting ourselves off, separating ourselves, not being part of any international norm or convention, this sense of inward-lookingness, and the sort of whiff of xenophobia that we had from the Leave campaign, the feeling that people already have of a sort of zero-sum British nationalism. I mean, we're just giving gift after gift to the SNP. We're paying no heed whatsoever to Scottish sensitivities, the fact that the majority of Scots voted to remain. And I think all this is pushing that segment of Scottish opinion which voted to stay in the UK in the 2014 referendum more and more towards the Scottish nationalist camp. Well, if that's what people want, then just carry on and say goodbye to the Union. But that's something I would deplore.
Michael, or thought on this?
I'll just say three things very briefly. The first is that I do not believe that we should leave the or denounce the European Convention on Human Rights at all. I think that there are some modest and proportionate reforms that we can undertake in order to ensure that things work better. But we can return to this perhaps in a future seminar that the Judicial Power Project might lead. I did some work with David Cameron and with Dominic Raab on this, and I'd love to return to it. I think that we can make sure that it works better in everyone's interests, but I am a strong supporter of remaining a signatory and fully signed up to the convention. The second point that Peter makes about Scotland, I think, again, it's important. It is, of course, the case that 62% of people in Scotland who voted to remain within the European Union. But there are deep currents here, and I take Peter's point, and Peter is a convinced, serious and effective advocate for the UK overall and for the Union. But I think that if we're looking at the reasons why support for the SNP has grown in recent years, there are many, many factors that one needs to look at from the, well, let's return to them in the future, but I think it's worthy of a discussion in its own right. But the third point is, again, Peter talks about xenophobia. I understand Peter's point, but I think it's absolutely important for all of us, and I know that Peter recognizes this, to move beyond a characterization of those who voted leave that uses phraseology like that. I think that for the future, in the same way as if one looks back at some rhetoric, you can see a way in which the Remain case was characterized by some on the Leave side in a way that was a caricature and ungracious. I think we should leave that behind. I think that what we should seek to do now is to better understand the motives and arguments and impulses of both sides of the debate in order to recognize that, as I mentioned earlier, the nobility and the idealism behind many of those on the Remain side is worth capturing. And now that we're out, there are other ways in which that nobility and idealism can be channeled and directed to strengthen the whole UK.
Thank you.
If I may, I did not characterize people who voted in that way as being xenophobic. What I said was, I described the sense of inward-lookingness and the whiff of xenophobia of the Leave campaign, not people who voted Leave, just to be precise.
I think, if I may, that I think Michael is right that the government does not have the capacity or the desire to leave the Convention on Human Rights. I think Turkey is more likely to join the EU.
Briefly in response to Peter, in the immortal words of General de Gaulle, je vous ai compris.
Thank you. We've got limited time. If I can take the last questions as a trio, if you could keep questions brief so that everybody also can wrap up some summing up comments, because as I say, time is short now. Dr. Graham Gudgeon, then Tessa Sifkovits of the Austrian magazine Profil, and then John Peter, The Economist. Graham, first over to you. Can you hear me?
Thank you, Dean. Yes. My question was to David Frost. He may have gone now, so let me ask it to everyone. How long do you think it will be before EU attitudes to the UK cease to be dominated by disappointment about Brexit?
Thank you. And Tessa Sifkovits, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me? Thank you for taking my questions. I was wondering, and this is a question for all panelists, but particularly to Lord Frost, if the rollout of the vaccine and the procurement is a success story and shows that Brexit has its advantages for the UK.
Good. Well, they're related to Matt Ridley's question and one or two of the questions you just heard, actually. I wanted to ask the panel, and I know Lord Frost is not there anymore, was it inevitable not just that we should have a hard Brexit, which I think Robert Tomb's book implies, although I don't agree with that actually, but it became inevitable after December 2019. Was it inevitable not that we should just have that, but also that we should have a very bad-tempered Brexit? When Switzerland and Norway turned their backs on this project, they rapidly concluded that they should be friendly and find friendly relations with this very important group. We seem not to be going down that road.
Would panelists now like maybe to just wrap in their answers, questions, not all of which were directly addressing points in Robert Tombs's book, but nonetheless respond to those and then wrap in their sort of valedictory comments for tonight. Perhaps if I ask Robert to have the last words, since it's his work we're talking about. Peter, do you want to respond to those first and then?
Look, I'm going to go back to what I said originally, which is that it's now no longer a choice between remain and leave. It's between success and failure. And I think that the anxiety I have is that overall, Brexit has made the UK look less successful in the eyes of many internationally, as I encounter a lot in my everyday work, but also less successful with a bright, less future in the eyes of many, both in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And it's going to make them think further about whether they want to remain part of the UK. And I would just underline, if you don't mind, what I said before, which is that all of us who believe in the United Kingdom are going to have to work very, very much harder to create a more optimistic vision of our country, one where we are really advancing the cause and the prospects of success rather than failure, and entering an era not of national decline, but as I said originally, of reinvention. And I just think this would be immensely helped if the Brexiter tribe, if you don't mind me describing them as such, would just put the interests of the Union rather more uppermost as they, plot their moves across this minefield, rather than relegate it to an afterthought, as I fear that some are doing.
Michael.
Oh, thank you very much, Dean. What I'd love to do is to resume the conversation about the Union with Peter and others, perhaps under your auspices at some point in the future, because I think it's so important and there are so many strands to that debate. In response to the, and there's no one better equipped to bring authority to that discussion than Peter, who was, as you pointed out earlier, an outstanding Secretary of State for Northern Ireland when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. On Graham Gudgeon's point about how long, again, the political moods, like the weather, can change rapidly. I think that it's certainly the case that there are some, there's, I don't need to enumerate them. There are some issues which are causing difficulties at the moment, but I think that with goodwill on both sides, following again from what Peter and Amber said, we can move to a better position. On Tessa's point about vaccines, the point has been well made that it would have been theoretically possible if the UK was still in the EU for us to have taken a different course from the EU and to have gone down our own route. But it's impossible to know, but I don't believe that we necessarily would have had we still been in the EU. But good men and women can divide on that. On John Peet's critical point, which of course relates to Graham's, I think it was the case, as Amber said, that there was an effort in the difficult parliamentary circumstances between 2017 and 2019 to find a compromise. And there were many, many different types of compromise. So it wasn't inevitable that we should end up with a type of departure from the European Union that we had. There could have been many, many different outcomes, branching histories, as Dominic put it. But I think it's only fair to say that the Leave campaign argued that it was logical leave the single market and the customs union and to be outside the jurisdiction of the ECJ. So what is now characterized as a hard Brexit was the case that was put forward by the Leave campaign. And indeed, you know, some criticized us for that, but we were clear about what leaving involved, and other varieties or flavors of Brexit may recommend themselves to others, but that was what the Leave campaign argued for. And on the final point that John makes about bad-tempered or whatever, again, I would take issue with that, you know, without seeking in any way to suggest that everything is brilliantly harmonious, because we all know one or two of the issues that are out there. Nevertheless, it is the case that there are British troops in the Sahel as part of Operation MINUSMA, alongside French colleagues. There are British troops in Estonia helping to safeguard the security of that part of the European Union. There is active collaboration going on, led by my colleague Alex Sharma, with European nations to ensure that COP26 is as much of a success as the Paris COP that Amber helped to helm. So there are manifold ways in which the UK and European nations and the European Union are cooperating. Again, I'm not trying to be Panglossian, but I am anxious to stress that we mustn't allow the clouds in the sky to blind us to the fact that there is so much that we do have in common.
Amber.
Thank you, Dean. And yes, I think the shared endeavours is what will bring us back together. So that sort of answers the first question, how long will it take? I think that as more time and more events put between us and the actual Brexit, the lesser it will seem when we're confronted with bigger issues such as climate change, which we're all trying to address. And that is such a big challenge going forward. The issue about vaccines and EU and Peter's point about nimbleness is so true. And you can see immediately that the UK has been able to deal very well with this because of its ability to immediately react. And I agree with Michael, it was lovely to think that it would have been nice if we'd been members of the EU, that we could have led and helped deliver a better outcome for the EU, but one wonders whether that would have taken place. But the final question I thought was so interesting is why was it all, not just, why is it not still bad-tempered with the EU, but why was it all so bad-tempered over the past 5 years? And over the past 5 years, we're still, Robert, I'm still sort of bristling slightly at some of the language in your book, Justifying Leave. I can't really just explain why it's so deep, where people got so wound up, and I am amongst them, about wanting to get a certain outcome, and coming down from that has been hard. And the only way, I think, the best way that we're going to see some leadership on that is for Michael and his government to make sure that it is as inclusive and resists the temptation to go to those of us who recognise who won here, but are still licking our wounds.
Thank you. Robert, the last word, since it's your work.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you to all the panel for a very interesting discussion. All I would say is that I think the EU is doing its best to help us to move on from this. I think that the EU will have its own problems to look after in the next couple of years and may be more content to allow us to go our own way. And I think that the Union will actually be safer after Brexit than it was before. So I think we agree that the question now is not in or out, but success or failure, and we all agree that success is what we need and must have. But thank you again for all that you said and for your kind comments, and also your not so kind comments about my book, which I shall take to heart. But thank you for your kindness in being present and in taking part in the discussion, and to you, Dean, for having organised the whole thing.
And thank you all, and just so you know, This Sovereign Isle is available in bookshops, and for those of you who haven't read it, I'd recommend a good, hearty read. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to our brilliant panelists. Thank you to the audience, and look forward to welcoming you back
Sovereign
here.
Isles. Sovereign Isles, Dean.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sovereign Isle, yes. Thank you, everybody. Come back soon.